The New York Times, which I rarely quote for obvious reasons, in its Millennium edition of January 1st, 2000, had a column on the front page called Myths of the 20th Century. Myths of the 20th Century. And one of the myths of the 20th century they listed was the myth of overpopulation. It is a myth. It was a myth. Of course, it's also in the air that we breathe. It's in social science textbooks from elementary school on, and it is still taught at our universities. After World War II, we began with the help of modern medicine to reduce the death rate worldwide. Population began to increase rapidly. From 1960 to 2000, the world's population went from 3 billion to 6 billion. And people like Paul Ehrlich, writing in The Population Bomb in 1968, Paul Ehrlich, my former colleague at Stanford University, said, quote, "The battle to feed humanity is over. Hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in the 70s because of this rapid population increase." Well, it never happened. Hundreds of millions of people didn't starve to death in the 70s, so he wrote another book predicting that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death in the 80s. You might think he couldn't pull it off a second time, but he did. He sold lots of millions of copies. He was on Johnny Carson 42 times. And he sold the myth of overpopulation. What actually happened from 1960 to 2000 was this, that we had a one-time doubling of the world's population, precisely because death rates fell so rapidly. Birth rates also fell, but more slowly. We saw lifespans, human lifespans lengthen from 40 years on average worldwide in 1950 to almost 70 years today, worldwide. When you have people living nearly twice as long, you're naturally going to have nearly twice as many people around. This one-time doubling in the population came about because of increasing lifespans, better health care, better food, better shelter, and so forth. The world's population will never double again. Instead, what you see in many countries, coming to your question, is a birth rate that is well below replacement. Europe is dying. It has been for the last decade. Every country in Europe, from Catholic Ireland all the way to European Russia, has a birth rate that is below replacement, below the 2.1 children you need to maintain the current population. I think the only exception to that is Albania and Malta, and those aren't major players demographically. The average family size now in Europe is 1.3 children. This is a recipe for demographic disaster. This is a recipe not for population explosion, but population implosion, where the population first ages and then begins dying. Italy is dying. Is losing people every year. 15 countries in Europe are losing population from year to year. Japan is dying. South Korea will soon be. Taiwan, Singapore. All the developed countries of the world have birth rates that are too low to maintain the current population, with one exception, the United States. Countries like Russia are desperate. Russia's losing nearly 1 million people a year. Every baby in Russia born, it results in the government awarding the parents a bonus, a baby bonus of $9,000. $9,000. So desperate are they to get the birth rate up. There are baby bonuses now in many European countries. There's something called Kindergeld that's paid in the German-speaking countries, Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. Kindergeld, child money, where you get a certain amount of money paid to you by the government for each child you have. Is it making a difference? No. Those countries are still dying. Europe is going to lose a couple 100 million people over the course of the next century, and other countries are following. Even in the less developed world, birth rates are falling very rapidly. This whole business of zero population growth, where we're going to magically come down to the perfect family, supposedly. I have an imperfect family. I have 9 children. But the perfect family, father. You see, I'm personally opposed to the one-child policy. So, the perfect family, supposedly, of zero population growth and father, mother, and 2 children doesn't really exist. There's nothing magical about 2 children. When you convince people that babies are a burden, when you convince them that having children means a huge economic sacrifice, when you convince them that for the good of the planet you have to have fewer children, they don't stop at 2. they have no children, or they have one child. And so we see in many European countries very, very small families. Italy, 68 million people a day. By the end of the century, we'll have about 30 million people. Eventually, if this continues, of course, the Italians would die out. Come back to Italy in 100 years, the great cathedrals will still be there, but the ticket takers and the people in the streets will mostly be North African or Albanian. The Italians will be gone. I love them, but if they don't have children, they won't be here in a couple generations.